Well, I'd like to welcome all of you here to another installation in the Hayek lecture series. Just to remind you, this is a lecture series that is sponsored by the Thomas Smith Foundation with a grant from them, and then on campus the PP&E program, the Center for the History of Political Economy, and the Duke program on American Values and Institutions are all faculty and local sponsors. We're delighted to have Angus Burgin with us today. Angus has recently, he's a professor at Johns Hopkins University and recently published a book, The Great Persuasion, Reinventing Free Markets Since the Depression. The book has gotten quite a good response so far. One of the most prominent of these was perhaps the New Republic review by Nobel Prize winner Bob Solow. Today, Angus is going to talk, the title of his talk is Planning Against Planning, the Mont Pelerin Society and the Origins of Neoliberalism. So, Angus, please.
Thank you, Bruce. So as Bruce noted, my home university is Johns Hopkins, which, as a point of pride or shame, depending on your perspective, is the #1 recipient of federal research funds across all universities nationwide. So in recent weeks, as you can imagine, this has meant that sequestration this Friday has been a subject of great anxiety. There's been talk of salary freezes, budget constraints, other indignities that can filter down even to those lowly humanists whom the federal government has little interest in funding. And so we've all seen, right, in the talk about sequestration in recent days, the headlines about how some Republicans in Congress are now looking favorably even on cuts in defense spending that were once intended to serve as a kind of threatening cudgel to force the creation of a compromise bill. And here I think we can see that what some historians have referred to as the three-legged stool of post-war conservatism, that is, on the one hand, a vigorous national defense, on the other hand, a support for social traditions, religious traditions, and also support for the free market, seems to be to some extent eroding as the latter, as this support for the free market becomes ever more central, ever more powerful. So as we grapple with these changing political configurations at this moment in time, I think it becomes all the more important to look back on the long history of free market ideas, that is, to inquire about the lineage of this strong support for the market mechanism that's evident, profoundly evident in the halls of Congress and some sections of the media today. So what is the source of these widespread commitments and assumptions? How did these ideas change over time? This is a central problem of my book, The Great Persuasion, which looks at changing ideas about the free market in the period between the Great Depression and today. So I argue here that in the years immediately following the onset of the Depression, laissez-faire economics were largely marginalized within the international scholarly community and the American political environment. Professional economists broadly supported progressive policies, and the general population believed unregulated capitalism to have been discredited by experiences of catastrophic volatility. A half-century later, opposition to state interference in the actions of the competitive market had become much more widespread within economics faculties and increasingly influential in the public sphere. So I think this story needs to be told to some extent as one that occurs at the boundaries between ideas and politics. Most treatments of market advocacy have devoted remarkably little attention, I think, to these points of intersection. So it's natural, right, that economists are most interested in the history of economic ideas, that historians, although this has been changing to some extent in recent years, are more interested in the social history of this phenomenon, right? The rise of the conservative movement from below as a domestic phenomenon rooted in a set of social anxieties and defined political goals. There's a thick space, one that traverses the boundaries between economic theory, moral philosophy, and popular politics that remains, in my opinion, insufficiently understood. So I'm hoping to cast some light, both in my talk today and in greater detail and nuance in the book itself, on the workings of this space by asking a set of questions. Questions that include when and why did academic intellectuals begin advocating in new ways for the free market? Who advocated for their ideas in the public arena? How did these individuals explain and justify their beliefs? How did their ideas change with the passage of time? Which institutions supported them, and why and how did they do so? What was the importance of these institutional roles? And finally, how should we understand the the complicated dynamic between venues of abstract debate and the surrounding social and political environment. So in order to address these questions today, I'm going to focus on a specific group of people who coalesced into a self-conscious movement about a half century ago. And so this is a group of people that's going to be deeply familiar to some of you in this room and probably completely unfamiliar to others. And so I'll try to give you a little bit of basic information before I get into the details. The person who brought this group together was Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist who'd taken up a professorship at the London School of Economics in the early 1930s, and who would later transition to a post on the newly constituted Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago in 1950. Now, Hayek had been prominent among economists in the early 30s due to his strident opposition to Keynes. I saw that Nicholas Wapshott gave a lecture here on this series a couple years ago, right? So some of you who might have attended that. But by the outset of the Second World War, Keynes's ideas had swept many areas of the economics profession, leaving Hayek in many ways a very well-known but largely marginalized figure within the profession. And he passed the war years in relative seclusion at the University of Cambridge, cut off from most of his colleagues in continental Europe and the United States, and largely bypassed by contemporary debates. Initially, he even struggled to find a publisher who was willing to come out with the major product of this period in his career in the United States, a popular treatise that many of us are familiar with, The Road to Serfdom, which argued that government intervention was increasing at a rate that would eventually lead to the curtailment of basic human freedoms. But following the book's initial publication in England, copies began to sell at an extraordinary pace, propelling him to spectacular sales in the United States and all the things that can accompany that, a front-page review in the New York Times Book Review, and an unanticipated career as a public intellectual. He went on a lecture tour across the United States. His first lecture was to an overflowing, several thousand-person audience, basically when he was fresh off the boat in New York. And it went onwards from there in a peculiar populist embrace of the abstract theories of a Viennese intellectual, someone who presented himself very much as a Viennese intellectual. So as the war began drawing to a close, Hayek decided that the time had come for him to leverage this public status, that this public status was a kind of tool that he could use to help further the advancement of his ideas. And the way that he wanted to do this, it wasn't by projecting it to a broader public. He was deeply ambivalent about the lecture tour itself and about many of the people who saw themselves as sharing his ideas, but rather through the creation of a new society, a group that would bring together intellectuals from across the world and across various political, economic, historical disciplines who sympathized with his beliefs. So in a private memorandum he distributed to a number of these people, he explained the confluence of events that justified the establishment of this kind of organization at this particular moment in time. The hardening of national boundaries, he thought, and the difficulties in communication engendered by the wartime environment, something he was very sensitive to, had left intellectuals isolated and incapable of profiting from one another's ideas. As he said, the war has divided the world into a number of intellectual islands separated from each other as never before in modern history. So this was hard for everyone, right? It was hard for any scholar to not be able to communicate across national boundaries, but it was particularly hard, Hayek thought, for those who held dissident views. That is, those whose views didn't conform with those in their national environments found it all the more important to build communities across international lines. And free market advocates were particularly unpopular, as I indicated in my previous comments. So by providing a forum for people who held these common views, he hoped to foster a new sense of association among people who perceived themselves within their home environments to be very much alone. So in his pre-war travels between the London School of Economics, the University of Chicago, Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, a group of people had identified themselves as a loose network of sympathizers across national and disciplinary boundaries. And Hayek had been increasingly struck by what one of his colleagues, Wilhelm Rübke, a professor of economics and sociology at Geneva, described as the astonishing parallelism of our thinking. I think it's a striking phrase, the sense that the same beliefs, ideas, and plans were being arrived at by people in different national environments, working largely independent of one another, within separate lines of inquiry. So this dream of a new group was born at a very distinct moment in time, one in which a group of individuals shared a set of ideas and convictions, but no institutional structure or common venue. He wanted to turn this established network into a nascent community. And his goal was to promote not only free market economic policies, and I think this is crucial, but also the observance of a universally valid moral standard in politics, universally valid moral standards, and the common background of ideas and values which a civilization needs to survive. So this is an enterprise that's oriented not only around markets, but also around moral standards and values. And he wanted it to influence political events by providing a forum for ideas rather than engaging in any overtly political activities. So this wasn't a propaganda institution, it wasn't for political proselytizing, it was very much an institution for a kind of academic discussion. And the reason for this is that he viewed its influence as something that would unfold over a long time horizon. One of the really striking things about reading these people is how extensively they theorized the mechanisms for the influence of their ideas. And Hayek thought that the way in which he could be most influential in the public sphere was specifically to look on a long time horizon rather than a short one. So he said, I freely admit that I neither expect immediate results nor believe that any efforts that aim at them are likely to change the general trend of opinion. Instead, he drew quite explicitly on the example of the Fabians who founded his home institution, the LSE, to adopt a long-term approach to the advancement of ideological change. So he hoped the relationship between the society and its members would be much like the relationship between a well-established legal order and its constituents. That is, it would merely provide the framework within each of the individuals involved would pursue their products with the greatest possible degree of mutually beneficial interaction with one another. The genius of this structure, he thought, and I think this is crucial, is precisely the limitations that it would set on itself. Hayek believed that the most effective way to generate political change would be to avoid any explicit attempt to pursue it. Okay, so having finally brought this group together, and he obtained funding through a fairly difficult and circuitous process, which he can talk about, he convinced 39 founding members to gather together for a week in 1947 at the base of Mont Pelerin in Switzerland. And the assembled group was in some ways eclectic, so he worked very hard to get a broad range of different kinds of people. He brought together journalists, business people, politicians, academics. This wasn't all economists. And they came from countries including France, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, England, the United States, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, right? Only 39 people, but many different nationalities. This speaks to the importance of transnational dialogue to Hayek. But in other senses, this group was distinctly homogeneous, right? This whole group at this point in time was from around the Atlantic world, a distinct unit, geographical space. All the participants were white men. None came from outside of this geographical region. All of them were chosen due to positions within a political, financial, or academic elite, right? This is a distinct group of people, even if they crossed very different disciplinary boundaries. And the conference that they had together lasted a week. It was divided between formal sessions and excursions into the countryside, so it wasn't all just sitting around a table, but it was long. You were spending a long time together with the same small group of people. And many of the participants found this to be an extraordinary experience. And so when you go through the archives and you read for Friedman, for instance, it was his first time traveling abroad. So to take an ocean liner, still the way you traveled to Europe for the most part, to take an ocean liner across the Atlantic Ocean and travel across war-ravaged Europe was a stunning and transformative experience in some ways for him. And even for the Europeans, it was a remarkable experience. So lots of people, actually a number of the recollections of the conference talk about Walter Eucken, the very distinguished German economist, and his astonishment at seeing an orange for the first time. It would have been a number of years, right? So this elderly distinguished economist marveling at an orange was a kind of symbol of the collapse of international boundaries that this event represented. So following a fairly extensive debate about it, actually, they decided to christen this group the Mont Pelerin Society. That's the name that we still know it by today. It still exists. And to make this the first in a series of regular meetings. And Hayek outlined his goals for this group in a speech before the members. And this gets at some of the core problems that I'm trying to address here. So first, he thought that they should identify the philosophical premises of a new liberalism. And new is really important, right? He wanted this to be different from prior iterations of the term. So what is liberalism? So Hayek defined liberalism as a social philosophy that emphasized the protection of political and economic freedoms. For him, for many of his mid-century colleagues, the word didn't hold the progressive connotations that it holds for us today. So in order to create this new liberalism, Hayek believed that it would be necessary to abandon what he saw as a hostility to moral and cultural traditions that earlier liberals had often demonstrated. So the term of vituperation right here is Manchester liberalism, a certain kind of liberalism that was, so invoking Mill, for instance, that was hostile to religion. Hayek thought that that was in many ways fatal to its capacities in the public sphere. And also he wanted it to abandon, in his terms, a false rationalism, a term he uses, in favor of intellectual humility, and in doing so to heal the breach between the true liberal and religious convictions which continued to prevent a revival of liberal forces. So this laid out many of the basic issues that the members would discuss over the course of the week. Unfortunately, for this meeting, unlike many of the later ones, the discussions are actually transcribed, although not with perfect accuracy. So the debates covered in these transcripts are fascinating, but I can't obviously in a short lecture really walk through them. That's why I want to just pass this little handout around, which contains a document. Be familiar to some of you, the Society's Statement of Aims. And I think we can look through it to try to get some of the core enterprises that they were trying to achieve at this moment. So they spent the first thing to know is that they spent actually a fair amount of time debating the composition of this document. They sat around, passed around a draft, tore it apart, went back to the drawing board. This was a last-ditch effort that was written, most of the language was written by Lionel Robbins, a colleague of Hayek's at the LSE. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of aspects of this statement that I think get at this first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society and the general state of opinion within this group at this point in time. So first, it's very clear from reading this that the group shared Hayek's desire to create a new social philosophy, right? They're not trying to revive an older version of liberalism, they're trying to construct something different. So the primary goal of this organization isn't propaganda in support of some established or fully developed worldview, but rather, as it enumerates, further study. Additionally, while the views would be generally pro-market, right, this is posed as a defense of the market mechanism, it's clearly based around a rejection of anything that would resemble laissez-faire. So if you look at point 3, for example, you can see the call to prevent private rights from becoming a basis of predatory power, an implicit critique of corporate monopolies, one that was broadly shared by the members at the time. Even Aaron Director at this meeting expressed sympathy for that view. And in point 4, the explicit affirmation of the need for minimum standards of living. So you can see here the document reflects a belief which many of them openly expressed in the transcripts at the meeting, that the leading advocates of free markets in the 19th century, right, the classic figures of British liberalism in the 19th century, had an orientation toward laissez-faire and a concomitant hostility to religion, laid the groundwork for the financial and political dislocations of the 1930s, that something needed to be overcome in order to rehabilitate the concept of the market. Additionally, the members had a much easier time defending their ideas in relation to what they opposed than defining what precisely brought them together. I think this is crucial to understand too. One way that you can see this is that they couldn't actually identify a single term to describe their shared worldview. They sometimes referred to themselves as conservatives, as liberals, as classical liberals, as neoliberals, as libertarians, even a few people used at this time, as individualists, but all of them expressed disagreement with one or another of these terms, right? So they'd sit around the table. In some ways, it seems absurd to read these long transcripts of people saying, what do we call ourselves, debating what seems to be a purely semantic problem. But I also think this is really significant in a way. Terms are themselves important. They serve to provide a conceptual umbrella around which the disparate members of a community can unite. In that sense, they can provide a crucial tool to hide points of difference when an atmosphere of unity is needed. And they also can signify that people share a coherent and fundamentally similar project, right? And so if somebody thought that they weren't a libertarian and somebody thought that they were, that signified not only a terminological difference, but also in some ways a difference in their worldview. So often when you read histories of this period in time, that refers to a kind of unified neoliberalism. Right? This is a neoliberal movement. But when you actually dive into the transcripts, you begin to find that it's deeply torn by internal disagreements, that they couldn't agree even on a short statement of this kind. One of the members refused to sign it. So in drawing the initial parameters of the Society's new social philosophy, the statement relies also heavily on a language of values. The founding members strongly believed that any support they provided for the market should not be embedded in what they saw as a kind of arid rationalism, but rather should be integrated into a holistic and value-oriented worldview. So the second paragraph of the statement I think is helpful here. It mentions the importance of, on the one hand, absolute moral standards, and on the other hand, competitive markets, right? So they're interested at the intersection between the two. And it contains itself there, I think, a tension that animates these early debates, right? How do you construct a philosophy that on the one hand adheres to certain kinds of absolute standards and on the other hand respects the adjudications of the market mechanism? So as countless examples demonstrate, right, and anybody who's read Schumpeter thinks a lot about these kinds of problems, markets frequently work to subvert or erode the moral conventions of the societies that they operate within. Arguably, there's no greater force for rapid social change. In their attempt to create a new social philosophy, the members of the society wanted to reconcile this power of social disruption with their commitment to the importance of maintaining stable social ideals. I think you can see here some of the crucial importance of stability to intellectuals coming out of the political and economic dislocations of the preceding decades. So this gives you a good sense of some of these initial issues that are dominating the society's first meeting. Now, the first thing, anybody who's attended a conference, I think, would agree that these kinds of issues are not generally decided definitively by intellectual societies, right? You put a bunch of intellectuals together in a room and they rarely coherently solve a problem. And the Mont Pelerin Society, sure enough, experienced a number of challenges in its attempts to fulfill its mandate. So one of those challenges is that precisely this sense of crisis that you can see deeply infusing this statement began over the course of the 1950s to fade away. The world was a very different place in the late 1950s than it was a decade before. And with each successive meeting following this gathering in 47, you can see the tenor of impending peril diminishing and new glimmers of optimism emerging. So in 1959, one member in an address, and I think this is telling itself, in an address entitled "The End of the Beginning," said a strong tide of public events, if not yet ideas, is running in our favor. And membership in the society itself manifested this. It rapidly grew. It grew from 39 people to over 100 in just its first couple of years. And its central premises were beginning to find their way into popular media and at the same time into public debate. And second, the society's membership itself began to change. This was a source of great anguish for Hayek over the course of its first 15 years. As I mentioned, it had a variety of disciplines at the first meeting, but the greatest aggregation, because they were contiguous to Hayek himself, were in economics. And through a kind of internal institutional logic, they gradually began to take over more and more of the society. And of course, the discipline of economics itself was changing in this period too. Right? It was becoming less and less of a literary discipline, more of a technical discipline, such that what economists talked about was increasingly inaccessible to those in contiguous disciplines. And so Hayek was working relentlessly to try to keep this membership talking across disciplinary boundaries. So he was enjoining people, like Michael Oakeshott is a good example, who he thought shared some of his basic views from other political or institutional foundations, to come to the meetings, but largely without success. So you can see this in 1970, one member proposed a session on Freudian Marxism, right? This deep specter of concern in the late 1960s, early 70s. And Hayek expressed the disjunction that he saw at that point in time. He said, "I very much wish that one could discuss this sort of problem in the Mont Pelerin Society, but my efforts to expand its membership in a direction that would enable it to do so haven't been successful." And so he'd reconciled himself to this goal to create an integrated dialogue across economics and social philosophy had in some sense failed. And this drift away from questions related to political philosophy and towards economics contributed to an increasingly libertarian perspective that was shared among its members. It transitioned from an institution in which foundational principles, again, as you can see in the statement, were intended to be explored, examined, debated, to one in which members largely focused their attention on applying free market solutions to problems of perceived misallocation. And this gradual transformation left many of its original members feeling deeply disillusioned with its trajectory. So I hesitate to cite him as an example of disillusionment because he was disillusioned about everything, but Frank Knight, the prominent Chicago economist, I think is a good example of this sentiment. He wrote in private correspondence at the time that the society was hurting the cause by going to extremes. And he said, "I'm interested in the cause of freedom, but with judicious limits. And these people seem to think of just giving everybody his own way, notably businessmen and property owners." Bertrand de Jouvenel, the French philosopher and a central participant in the 47 meeting, outlined his discomfort in grave detail in a 7-page letter that he sent to Milton Friedman in 1960. "It seems to me," he said, "that the society has turned increasingly to a Manichaeism, according to which the state can do no good and private enterprise can do no wrong." So both Knight and Juvenel wanted to distance themselves from an approach that focused on modes of application for convictions that they thought were too often simply assumed. Now, it's not coincidental that Juvenel's letter was sent to Milton Friedman, and that Knight identified Friedman as an exemplar of the society's changing worldview. If the early Mont Pelerin Society was distinguished by its pessimistic perspective on world political developments, you certainly can see that in the statement, by its orientation, or at least attempt to remain oriented towards political philosophy, and its attempt to reconcile free markets with social traditions. Friedman's work was notable for its optimistic perspective. Friedman is one of the most relentlessly optimistic social theorists you can read. Its focus on applied empirical economics, right? Friedman constantly emphasizes the empirical dimension of his thought. And its distaste for gradualism and traditionalism. Friedman was much less concerned with the preservation of social traditions than, say, Hayek. Though he never fully warmed to the label, this was an emboldened libertarianism in many ways, and its political premises remained sharply distinct from those enunciated in 1947. So these changes, I think, were clearly evident when Friedman convinced a reluctant Irving Kristol to participate in the 25th anniversary meeting of the Society in '72. So Kristol took a lot of cajoling to get him to show up in the first place, but once he agreed to come, Kristol focused his attention entirely on the points of divergence between his ideas and those shared by this second generation of Mont Pelerin Society members. And he identified Friedman as the emblematic figure for the Society's advocacy of the market in this period. And he excoriated him for refusing to engage, as he saw it, with any substantive criticisms of the cultural perils of capitalism. Kristol said, Friedman is reluctant to impose any prohibition or inhibition on the libertine tendencies of modern bourgeois society. He seems to assume that these dynamics cannot, in the nature of things, be self-destructive, that self-realization in a free society can only lead to the creation of a self that is compatible with such a society. So Friedman's assumptions, Kristol concluded, relied on a secular libertarian philosophy that, in his words, simply had too limited of an imagination when it came to vice. Such a philosophy assumed that individuals were not irredeemably corrupted in the process of private vices becoming public virtues. As Kristol said, it never really could believe that vice, when unconstrained by religion, morality, and law, might lead to viciousness. So Kristol thought that the members of the Mont Pelerin Society needed to situate their economic insights, which he thought were important and valuable and in many ways transformative, within a comprehensive moral framework that preserved a place for virtue and delineated boundaries of human interaction where the marketplace should be curtailed. Right? This might sound familiar. It resonates in many ways with the statement in front of you. Otherwise, he thought they risked undermining their substantial achievements by elevating what he saw as a partial truth to the status of the absolute. So these criticisms clearly delineate, I think, the changes that had occurred within this group over the course of its first 25 years. The ascendance of Friedman within its orbit signified the decline of Hayek's ambition to create an interdisciplinary dialogue, the relative ebbing of the influence of continental Europe in the social scientific world, and the decline of an attempt to create a new or revised liberalism in the ways in which they'd envisioned it at this initial meeting. At the same time, it marked the ascension of economics to the top of the social scientific pyramid, the increasing prestige of the American university, and the revival of a certain kind of laissez-faire as an influential social philosophy among academic theorists and in the public sphere. So scholars have often pointed to get back to a certain extent to this three-legged stool thing I brought up at the beginning, to this gap between libertarian and traditionalist thought, right? It's this divide that needs to be reconciled in some way. How is it that the modern Republican Party seems to hold both of these views at the same time? And sometimes scholars fall into what I see as a kind of trap in saying that people, by holding views and of these varying perspectives, modern Republicans, for instance, have an inherently self-contradictory worldview. But I think in considering the early history of the Mont Pelerin Society, it becomes clear that the stances adopted by contemporary libertarians and traditionalists, to use those terms, are themselves products of a contingent historical development. Debates in the conservative intellectual world immediately following the Second World War didn't occur within these kinds of rigid binaries, but rather it was, they were unfolding in a process that was thick with contestation and uncertainty. The Society's members both expressed a commitment to develop a new social philosophy and struggled to define what exactly this would entail. Only as the influence of this founding group and their mission receded, and a new generation of leaders emerged, did their points of disagreement rigidify, leading Hayek's carefully wrought consensus in this period to collapse into competing worldviews. So I think if one wants to evaluate this group in terms of its achievement of the goals that Hayek laid out for it, the assessment would be grim. As he grew older, I think Hayek actually came to share this view. He became very vocal about what he saw as the group's failings. Its debates never probed as deeply into founding principles as he had wished. It became dominated by individuals whose contributions Hayek believed to be least valuable, or who held ideas that he thought were in many ways less nuanced than his own. And it rapidly grew to a scale that its members believed had irredeemably influenced the character and the quality of its debates. Right? It's very different. If you attend a conference with 39 people for a week, then you get to know people across different disciplinary boundaries. There's been a certain quality threshold met by the attendees. Right? So you leave with lots of new relationships that can be formative for you in many ways. If you attend a meeting with 500 people, you're much more likely to cluster with people you already know or people like yourself. Right? The whole nature of the enterprise is fundamentally new. But if one asks a different set of questions, if one thinks about what kind of a role this society played in helping to foster the reemergence of free market ideas in the public sphere, if one thinks about public influence alone, I don't want to be excessively robust in thinking about this, but I think that the assessment could be much more positive. I think Friedman himself is a striking demonstration of the ways in which organizations of this time can subtly impact the careers of their participants and the snowballing effects that these kinds of changes can have on the participants' careers and those who eventually fall within their circle of influence. And so prior to 1947, Friedman was, as he characterized it himself, a young economist who didn't explicitly conceive of his work in overtly political terms. He recalled voting for Roosevelt in the 1936 election. During the war, of course, controversially, he played a role in helping to develop the withholding tax. As in his own words, he described himself as a young, naive, provincial American, a technical economist who used the tools he'd acquired in his training to develop largely professionally delineated problems. So his arrival at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, he said, marked my beginning in active involvement in the political process. Right? So I don't, you have to always be a little skeptical of the narratives people construct about themselves. You can certainly find points that are form a certain degree of disjunct with this, like his participation in the creation of Roofs or Ceilings, right, the pamphlet. But at the same time, we can talk more about this, I'm sure, conversation with Dan too. At the same time, the way that Friedman did define his political views when he addressed them in these early years were very different than they were at a later point. So beyond helping Friedman to come to conceive of his work in overtly political terms, it also provided a crucial set of interactions, right? I mean, one set of interactions that's obvious is with Karl Popper, when one thinks about Friedman's methodology. But another is with the Volcker Fund. Beginning in the 1950s, the fund financed a series of summer conferences in which students would participate in seminars and lectures with leading advocates for conservative ideas, or market-oriented ideas. So the leaders of this fund, right, who were involved in this initial meeting of the society, became acquainted with Friedman and offered to help to pay for him to become a regular contributor. And in the early 60s, Friedman's wife Rose adapted these lectures into Capitalism and Freedom, his first popular publication, which sold over 400,000 copies. And that book, in turn, caught the attention of Barry Goldwater and inspired him to ask Friedman to serve as his primary, on an informal basis, as his primary economic advisor. And the notoriety that Friedman gained in that role helped him to receive the invitation to become one of the triad of contributors to Newsweek, which was read by over 10 million readers well into the 1980s. And so in that column, Friedman brought to public attention a broad range of dramatic proposals that I would argue helped to define American political debate in the decades that followed in fundamental ways. So if you think about the replacement of welfare with a negative income tax, the adoption of school vouchers, Friedman was the first prominent figure in the American public sphere to advocate for that. The abolishment or emaciation of the minimum wage, public housing, Social Security, the estate tax, the military draft, government aid following natural disasters, a hot topic in recent weeks, or the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, something that's been coming up recently as well. Right? So Friedman was throwing all these ideas out in his Newsweek column, which in these various venues, when a sense of crisis took hold, people turned to Friedman's ideas and they became broadly influential. So I look at this just to think, in sort of loose terms about the cascading effect that these kinds of networks established by organizations like the Mont Pelerin Society can have. Right? Through a subtle process, they can help people to think of the implications of their scholarship in different ways, in more explicitly political ways. And they also can help to introduce people with others who can help to facilitate transitions to public activities. So to use terms that Friedman would appreciate, I think you can think of organizations like the Volcker Fund as the venture capitalists, in a sense, of the intellectual world, right? They spread a broad degree of bets. They bring in tons of people into the Mont Pelerin Society, and a lot of that money, they were quite conscious, is wasted, right? It doesn't really achieve anything related to their long-term goals. But if they have even just one spectacular success, one person whose career transforms in an important way, can help to justify many minor failures. Extended time horizons are punishing for interested parties to endure. Few have the patience to abide the protracted unfolding of the dynamic relationship between ideas, institutions, and processes of political change. And Friedman, I think, was the beneficiary of a network of organizations that were established by individuals in this period who were uniquely reconciled to the assumption that the nature of their impact would not necessarily be revealed until long after their ability to appreciate it had passed. So what stories can we take away from this? What are the basic observations that this narrative helps to reveal? So one, I think, is that it provides a reminder that the emergence of the conservative movement can't be participated from the growing interconnectivity of the late 20th century world. So scholars often talk about the flattening inspired by globalism, right? The notion that as the world becomes increasingly global, cultural differences erode. And there's a lot that's true in that narrative, but at the same time, I think the Mont Pelerin Society serves as an example of the ways in which the collapse of these barriers can help to incubate dissent. You see this in all these letters in its early meetings, the participants describing its formation with an astonishing sameness. Individuals who feel secluded in a home environment become, through acts of congregation and communication across international barriers, participants in a substantive and purposive community. And the members of the society were able to find traction only through these kinds of interpersonal transmission and engagement and support, right? Friedman said you can talk in very different ways if you aren't worried that as soon as you finish your sentence, somebody's going to stab you in the back, right? You need these kinds of networks of support in order to develop certain kinds of intellectual infrastructure. Second, I think that we see here, and I don't know if this will be a controversial argument in this environment, but it can be among historians, that the rise of the conservative movement wasn't overdetermined by its populism. Right? Even movements that have an anti-intellectual dimension are not wholly untouched by the philosopher's hand. The members of the Mont Pelerin Society performed a number of roles that I think are essential to the ascent of free market ideas over the long post-war era and to the conservative movement itself. They developed and refined academic theories that validated the predispositions of market advocates and convinced others to reformulate their views. They popularized their perspectives in mass market articles and books. They provided guidance to politicians and rhetoricians who more readily controlled the levers of legislative power. They lectured broadly in support of the policies they proposed and the ideas those policies embodied. They molded and trained subsequent generations of proselytizers and theoreticians. And they leveraged their reputations. I think this is very important. They leveraged their reputations to legitimize the philosophies that followers came to espouse. Right? I think you can see that in a lot of the invocations that you see of figures like Hayek, often from people who haven't read him in the present day, right? There's a kind of important intellectual legitimacy that a substantive intellectual figure can provide. So in this sense, I think we may not be the slaves of defunct economists, but we can't inhabit a world uncolonized by their ideas. And finally, as one would expect, but I don't think this is always implied in the scholarship, each meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society unfolded as a dialogue rather than a chorus. No two individuals who are really worthy of our attention ever held exactly the same views. And the society's sense, the loose sense of coherence that we can attribute to it, emerged only through a process of continued and substantive disputation. So too often histories of neoliberalism, as sociologists call it, or conservatism, as historians still sometimes call it, have fallen prey to a kind of social scientific impulse to harden ideas into rigid blocks. But I think it tells us something that these figures didn't accept those rigid blocks themselves, right? That they didn't call themselves conservatives or neoliberals in many cases, but instead engaged in disputation over what exactly they were. Amid their evident sympathies and points of convergence, they, like I think members of most ideological communities, devoted much closer attention to the problems that differentiated them rather than to the problems that brought them together. And those points of differentiation are important. They aren't merely gloss, they actually have real substance to them. And so they diverged over the appropriate nature of their political role. You can find lots of correspondence from people writing to Hayek saying, we need to engage, we need to have a journal, we need to engage in overt propaganda, we need to stop quibbling over minor details and start thinking about how to affect people's opinions today. And Hayek pushing back against that. They diverged over the ethical foundations and implications of capitalism. What are the ethical effects of a capitalist society? Somebody like Frank Knight had deep anxieties about that, while somebody like Milton Friedman thought the capitalist societies actually build precisely the virtues that you want to instill in a citizenry, a fundamentally different worldview. And they disagreed about the desirability and the practicability of laissez-faire, right? How extensive should government intervention be? Very substantial disagreements over the specific natures of the kinds of interventions that are appropriate and the kinds that aren't. So if you look at it synchronically, I think you can find moments of coherence. You look at one block in time, particularly as you get later in the society, and you can develop a set of views that more or less everyone holds. But viewed diachronically, the overwhelming impression is one of change. The evolution of its membership resulted in a transformation of shared assumptions. And in recent years, the advocates of free markets have been quite a bit more sanguine in their description of its benefits and less convinced of its limitations than was the case when this narrative began. So what is, if you're looking for one commonality, right? These people all got into society, what did they really share? One commonality that cohered over time was a conviction that capitalist modes of social organization should be encouraged and preserved, right? That the market itself is a fundamental good that needs to be protected. And in 1947, against the persistent specter of communism and the global detritus of ideological war, in many ways that was distinction enough, right? That was reason enough to bring the group together. The question which they then sought to address and about which they continually disagreed was what kind of capitalism you want to inhabit. If you assume that the market is a good, how extensive should it be? Where and why should the price mechanism be implemented or restrained? In subsequent decades, assumptions about the benefits of markets came to be much more broadly shared. And as I see it, the members of the Mont Pelerin Society moved rightward with their surroundings. Their advocacy transitioned from this generic category and contested category of capitalism to the much more specific category of capitalism unencumbered by substantial constraints. So in the wake of the recent financial crisis, as we think about issues like sequestration, the community, the national and the global community, is left to confront, again, the questions with which the society's members began. That is, to what extent do we wish to live in a market-centered world? And this clearly remains a source of discontent. We've accepted the virtues of markets, but failed to determine how to integrate them into life as we wish it to be.
We have 15 minutes, and I'll just let you take your own questions.
Sounds good, yeah, great.
Angus?
Yes, Dan, I thought you had some questions.
Was Frank Knight the person who refused to sign the statement?
No, it was Maurice Allais.
Oh.
Yeah, because he didn't believe in private property and land. Which is really, this is a stunning statement of the kind of political diversity of the society in this moment in 47, right? That you actually would invite somebody who doesn't believe in private property and land. I find that's very powerful. But Allais, this was enraging to Hayek because this statement, as you can see, it's pretty vague about what they share, and the fact that Allais even didn't feel comfortable with some of the implications of this was a source of frustration.
So if Hayek brought the group together, why did it turn out that it failed to live up to his ideals? Was it his personality, the personalities of the other people?
Well, so this is a big question. So, the first thing anybody who develops a substantial institutional infrastructure realizes is just how limited their control over it is, right? Institutions have their own internal dynamics, which founders, frequently to their frustration, can't manage. So I wouldn't attribute that to any sort of particular failing of Hayek's. I actually think that I write a little bit about this in the book, but Hayek, I think, was a remarkable kind of intellectual entrepreneur. And you can see this in the contrast between Hayek, and I briefly mentioned Wilhelm Röpke, who left the society in a kind of schism in the early 60s and envisioned creating an alternate society that would represent the worldview that he held which he called the Forum Atlanticum. And you can quickly see, as in his correspondence, that Rupke didn't have nearly the capacity that Hayek did to manage this kind of enterprise, right? Because the challenge here is that Hayek was corresponding on the one hand with funders who would write him letters saying things like, I'm not going to fund this guy's trip across the Atlantic because he doesn't believe what I believe. And at the same time corresponding with academics who were deeply concerned that this kind of organization was going to be a kind of propaganda mechanism, right? And so somebody like Karl Popper doesn't want to participate in an organization that is merely propounding an established worldview rather than engaging in, as Hayek emphasized, further study, right? So Hayek had to navigate very different players with very different individual agendas and figure out a way to get them all sitting at the same table. And the fact that he managed to do that in its early years, that he was successful in establishing a durable organization, is, I think, a testament to the fact that despite his fairly reserved and distant manner, he actually was a fairly savvy and capable constructor of institutions in a way that's relatively, as those of us in the academy know, is relatively rare among academic intellectuals.
You pointed out in passing that this was precisely the period of time in which economics itself changed to the regime of knowledge, which was impersonal and anonymous. And this was, of course, the exact same place where Hayek and Friedman began to operate. So the question of virtue is a question of the personalization of knowledge. And the question is that with this depersonalization, it becomes impossible
That's exactly right.
Is that part as well of the tension? You allude to it more in terms of Friedman's optimism. Is there not something structural involved in this?
Well, absolutely. I mean,
Could you perhaps repeat the question just in case Willie might be able to pick that up?
I think people will hear it.
Oh, okay,
If you
fine.
want to summarize briefly, it'd be fine.
I hesitate to rephrase for his elegant construction there, but so I mean, the basic question, as I sense it, is does this sort of, these moral gestures, sorts of questions of virtue, is the transformation in people's capacity to deal with them bound up in the transformation of the nature of inquiry in the economics discipline itself? And I think that's fundamental. I mean, there's a reason I talk a fair amount in the book about Friedman's methodology essay, right? Because Friedman's concept of economic methodology is fundamentally different from Hayek's, or even more so somebody like Mises. And in ways that emphasize precisely this kind of empirical dimension, as he sees it, that is abstracted from any sort of potential ideological or subjective knowledge in some ways. And so that's bound up in many ways with the kinds of conclusions that he arrives at. At the same time, I think one of the interesting things to look at in the archives is the sense of frustration that you get from a lot of these first generation figures of precisely this kind of these kinds of implications, right? What they saw as a kind of false precision implied in mathematical methodologies, which abstracted debates from a thicker social and political environment. So somebody like Cannon, right, at the London School of Economics wrote a lot about this, and what he saw as the decline of literary economics is a deeply troubling phenomenon. And it was something that also worried Frank Knight a great deal as well. And so you can map onto this. And the final thing I'll just say, I know there are a lot more questions, but speaking to this group, I think it's germane, is that the transformation of the history of economic thought itself. I mean, I was stunned in looking at the archives in the 1930s of Friedman's syllabi and just how heavy they were on the history of thought. And so part of the transformation of the discipline is the de-emphasis on history of thought as a constitutive part of the doctoral education, which then changes. It's important that Friedman was reading Smith, was reading Mill, was reading Dicey in graduate school, because that gave him the capacity to ask certain kinds of political, philosophical questions that if you're reading only more recent economic literature, you're less equipped to engage. You look skeptical of that claim.
And the people who effected those changes, from Longa and Marshak and Arrow and DeBrew, they were all reading those same things.
Yeah, but
they were going in different places.
Yeah, but the real question, right, to me, is the subsequent generation. I mean, it's the subsequent generation's capacity to, to contest some of the developments in economics over the intervening years. I think was mitigated by the readings they were doing in graduate school.
My question is, I guess, related to the sense of changes in the institution of the university.
Yeah.
As I fully agree, there was a disagreement, debate, dialogical binding between these people. But perhaps it was just this which didn't work at the universities, at least in the US. I was wondered in this sentence here, in this statement of aims, believing that what is essentially an ideological movement must be met by intellectual argument.
Yeah.
This just wouldn't work in universities as a statement of aims of the economics department. So apparently, the Montpellier Society was really a different response to the same situation of the Second World War as was.
Wait, so it wouldn't work because, sorry, just to.
Mainstream economics departments or mainstream, not only economics as other departments.
Yeah.
And I'm saying so because you emphasized that there was an academic.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was just
Yeah.
not an academic mission,
Yeah.
but there was also a fundamental mistrust into scientific institutions that became expressed in this Montpellier Society.
Okay, well, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, I think that one really interesting point to look at in thinking about precisely these questions is the Hayek-Popper correspondence leading up to the creation of the society, right? Where Hayek said that if your goal is to have a legitimately academic enterprise here, if your goal is legitimately further study, it needs to be, as Popper termed it, an open society, right? It needs to, so Popper was saying that you need to bring people who believe in socialism into the group if you want to be engaging in questions about foundational premises, because otherwise if you're taking certain core precepts for granted, then it really isn't about further study, right? It's about, to a certain extent, what you can do with these foundational assumptions which nobody there is willing to contest. To which Hayek said, and this is building on Hayek's own epistemology, but I mean it's that you need certain kinds of foundational presuppositions in order to engage in productive debate. That if you have no shared presuppositions, you have no capacity to converse, to construct anything. And so, I think that to me was a very revealing correspondence, because it gets to the fundamental tension in the notion of creating a group oriented around further study, but in the same time in which it's assumed that there's a certain ideological core that's binding it together, right? It's motivated to some extent in an ideological way. And that does make it, in some ways like an academic institutions, but in some ways different. Yes, yeah.
Which is available, by the way.
Yeah.
Along his lines, the fellow from Alabama.
Yes.
The focus of the Mount Pelerin Society, you had government privileged societies before 1700, right?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Government privileged societies. Economics was government privilege before 1700.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So it was organized around the government. You come to the government, and we're going to give you something.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like what it is right now. So then you had the rise of markets, free people. Right?
Yeah.
And that was emergent or spontaneous order. That came from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the United States experience, from 1780 to 1890, right, was that the original Mount Pelerin Society? In other words, the entire, experience was the Mount Pelerin Society. And then came along Wilson and Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, and then you come back to government privileged societies again, and they're a total failure. So, in 47, did they get together and you said, they focused an attempt to focus people?
Yeah.
Saying, look back before.
Yeah.
Isn't that what you really wanted? Isn't what free market, free people?
Well, so the debate, the narrative that you constructed there, right? I mean, this is a central question for them. I mean, how do you construct the narrative of the 19th century? What do you say about the 19th century United States, for instance, right? So somebody like Karl Polanyi, who they were really engaging with in the 1950s, they worried a lot about. I mean, Karl Polanyi says, laissez-faire is constructed in all sorts of ways, and so there's this notion to him that, say, the 19th century American economy is all just spontaneous order and disembodied individuals is all wrong, right? And this is something a lot of historians today emphasize too, right? Is the development of the West is largely government subsidized railroad enterprises and so on. So it's a very thick and complicated story. And at the same time, somebody like Friedman, powerfully contests that and looks at the 19th century United States and approaches it in many ways as a society of disaggregated individuals, as the engine for its tremendous economic successes. And so, the very narrative that you just laid out of, absence of government intervention followed by government intervention and whatnot is something, this is a story that they all worried deeply about, and that different people within this group and between the members of this group and other groups had completely different understandings of. And that gets down to these thorny historical debates where sometimes the empirical data is limited enough or contested enough that it gets very hard to have any sort of final resolution, even though they're important discussions to have. Yeah?
Yes, I'm interested to know if you, in your book, discussed further a point that you came to at the end of the lecture in which you were talking about the different ways in which the members of the society or people associated with the society tried to either directly or indirectly influence politics. It's the point that you brought up at the start.
Yeah.
That the society decided not to be explicitly connected with politics.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if in the book you try to account, if you see a structure to these different methods that you discussed, lectures, policy, and so on. And I'm thinking of someone like Phil Morawski, who has a structure, sort of nested box structure, with certain kind of conspiracy logic there. But nevertheless, there's a certain structure that he sees. So you gestured with a number of different institutions and ways of going about this. Do you see those as coherent to a structure, or simply a set of different things that don't really connect up with one another in any kind of structured way?
Yeah, well, this is going to be a frustrating answer, but I think it's, the answer is just plural. So different individuals I'm writing about have very different conceptions of how these structures worked, right? One thing that I think is really striking is it's something that preoccupied Hayek and Friedman themselves, that they wrote a lot about precisely this question of the relationship between ideas and processes of political change and how they would unfold over time. They saw a sort of 20 or 30 year time cycle through which, they would relay their ideas to certain kinds of people, and then they would, whose ideas were manipulable in their early years, and then they would go to propound it in the public sphere. And then, but they didn't talk that much about the kinds of things that sociologists have been talking more about today. Another good example is the Medved's book on think tanks in America, right, that talks about precisely this kind of institutional space between politics and academic ideas that can be enormously powerful precisely because it's serving a kind of translating role that no other comparable institutions can play. I don't want to propound any single narrative about the relationship between the ideas and people in this group and the broader public. One reason is because they individually, you can look at the society itself, but they individually had such different relationships to this particular question. So I talked a lot about Hayek's reservations about public engagement. Friedman very explicitly had the old idea that ideas in a public space are basically like goods in a market. That is, that good ideas win out over time, and therefore one of his fundamental roles, even as an academic intellectual, is to engage in constant public debate, going all the way down to the level to participating in tax rallies. And so on, whereas somebody like Hayek was much more reserved about it, and somebody like Frank Knight, looking at the contrary example of Keynes, thought that the social scientists shouldn't engage with the broader public at all. Right? He only violated that a couple times in his career, but he generally thought that there was no explicit public role, that it actually was a violation of the social scientists' position to try to engage in explicit public outreach. And so these problems are deeply contested within the group. And there are many different ways in which you can, which I think a number of which have a certain kind of validity, in which you can model the ways in which these ideas filter into a broader public. But does that help to answer your question? Or? Okay. Yeah, Dan.
Angus, do you have a sense in how the schism you referred to, if that's the Hunold affair?
Yes.
Do you have a sense of the degree to which that was personalities and management of the Montpelier Society versus the ideas?
Yeah.
And I take it Hayek, in terms of the ideas, would have been on the losing side. To the extent that schism was a matter of ideas. So.
Yeah. So, the Hunold affair, for those who are untutored in the history of the Montpelier Society, was this secretary of the society, Albert Hunold, who had a deeply irascible personality that became increasingly problematic over time, and eventually created a deep rift in the society between him and some sympathizers with him, including the then president of the society in the early 60s, Wilhelm Röpke, and other members of the society, largely led, when you go through the archives, by Friedman and Fritz Machlup and some other people. And the way I map out that story is that it was a personal story. You obviously have to tell it in part through the story of Hunold himself, and his personal relationships. But at the same time, you can see in the contestation of that personal disagreement an ideological division that had emerged, right? So when we have personal disagreements, right, we tend not to say, I disagree with this person because I have petty, concerns, but rather you map it onto a broader sense of what you really fundamentally disagree about, right? You see this playing out, say, in disputes in the New York Review books all the time, where you sense that something is personal, but at the same time is being put in a broad ideological framework. And that ideological framework, I think, in the Hunold affair is very revealing. Is that the real concern expressed by all these people from, in particular Rupke, is I think does it most articulately, but this concern that the society had moved away from its initial animus towards, for somebody like Rupke, the problem, say, of agriculture is crucial. The family farm, right, the preservation of a certain kind of local community life that free markets can serve to destroy or to erode. And so talking about precisely those kinds of questions, how do you preserve the market mechanism, but at the same time preserve these cultural structures that he saw as foundational, was exactly why he wanted to attend the early meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society. And even if Hayek disagreed with a number of Rupke's ideas, I think Hayek very much shared that ambition. And that he didn't think that they could talk about those kinds of things anymore, that it just wasn't part of the animus of the group anymore. So I think that you can read out of the personal, you can read the political.
This one here.
Oh, Crawford, yes, great.
It seems to me there's a sort of paradox in the Mont Pelerin Society. Liberals during the late 1930s, at least a fair number of the ones that I know something about, we're concerned about the development of orthodoxies and groups that constrain free thought. I mean, they didn't want to be part of an ism or something that was responsive to a particular body of doctrine or common thought. And I'm wondering if one of the effects of the society was to kind of divide the liberals. And the people who were willing to go along with this style joined the society, and others who were kind of repulsed by it on their own. I mean, can you find sort of like two liberal groups at this time emerging as a result of this effort?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you see this, right? You see this with this progressive falling away. So all these figures, whether it's Michael Polanyi, Bertrand de Jouvenel, Frank Knight, Wilhelm Rupke. I mean, all these figures who, when you read the first meeting of the society, they're the central figures in its debates. And it's not a sort of singular process. It doesn't just happen all at once. But over time, they all grow uninterested or frustrated, write letters of resignation, which are very interesting to read, and stop participating. But at the same time, they don't recoalesce into some alternative group. Right? I mean, that was Rupke's ambition with this concept of this Forum Atlanticum, right? And in America, you had lots of people at the time who were talking about the new conservatives, with whom Rupke saw a lot of commonalities. People like Peter Viereck, to a certain extent, Russell Kirk, right? So, I mean, you had different bodies of people who seemed emblematic of these ideas, but at the same time, they didn't have their own Mont Pelerin Society, at least that I've become aware of, which was a frustration to some of them. And I think that in itself speaks to the ebbing of a certain set of ideas that I emphasized in the 1940s. It's the rise of a more robust view of the capacities of markets.
Well, I think we're out of time, so let's thank Angus for a very stimulating presentation. And Angus, would you make yourself available out there?
Sure, yes,
Anyone cares to purchase the book? The Great Persuasion by Angus Burgin.